Okay, this morning we are going to begin, and we are going to continue with Daf 25. It's been a while since we've met because Pesach got in the way, and there was another reason why something else got in the way. So we haven't met for a number of weeks, but we are going to continue, and we are very close. Today we're going to finish chapter 3, and we are very close to finishing the tractate. So it's going to be 6 more sessions. There are going to be some bumps along the road because of days that I'm out, and Shavuot also falls on a Sunday. But we're going to keep on moving. So here is, I'm going to pull up the screen here. How do I do that? Okay. Share screen. Here we go. And you should be able to see the screen right now. We are beginning with the Mishnah on the very last line of Daf 24b, and then we're going to move into 25a. If one says, Ha'omer yivarchucha tovim, if in your prayers you were to say, may the good, not the God, but may the good bless you, Tov, this is Harezo Derech Haminut. This is the way of heresy. Al kan sipur yagia rachamecha, if you say, just as your mercy extends to the bird's nest, or if you were to say, V'al Tov yizaker shemecha, may your name be mentioned with the good. Or you say in the Modim prayer, Modim, Modim, you say it twice as you begin the prayer, Mishat Kinoto. We silence the individual. Now notice there is a difference here. The first one, Yivarchucha Tovim, it's considered Derech Minut, it's the way of heresy. The other one, we shut the person up, which suggests to me that we're not really sure if this is a heretical statement, but it might be, and so therefore we want to stop the person from using that language. We'll get to this in the moment as we get to the Gemara. Hamichaneh ba'arayot. When you are reading the section which describes, in fact, we just read it yesterday, the forbidden sexual relations. If you don't say it as it's written, but you translate here, you're translating it into euphemisms. Because, as Steinsaltz says here, it's a sense of propriety. You're embarrassed to speak about that. I mean, it talks about incestuous relationships, and it's kind of embarrassing. So if you were to say that, then mishat kinoto, we silence that person, because you've got to say exactly you've got to translate it as the Torah text has it. Ha'omer umizaracha lo titein lahavir lemolech, Lo titain la'abara ba'aramiyuta. If you were to translate the verse, do not give any of your seed to set them apart to Molech, right? That's the prohibition of basically infanticide, which was done in the ancient world, and the Torah suggests was done in Canaan by the pagans. If you were to translate that as you can't give your seed to impregnate an Aramean woman, a Gentile person, he is silenced with rebuke. Mishat kinoto b'nizifa. And we'll get to that too. First of all, you've got to translate it directly for what it says, exactly as it says. And why are you translating it in this way, referring to Gentile women? Well, we'll get to that. Okay, so here the Gemara begins. Bishlama modim modim, demechazek shtei rishayot. We understand why you wouldn't allow a person to say modim modim, because it sounds like there are two, as he called, two authorities. Basically, there's two gods. That you're praising these two distinct, these two different deities. Certainly, at the time that the Talmud was written, and I guess even at the time of the Because remember, the Babylonians are living in Persia, where Zoroastrianism, which has a dualistic view of deities, is prominent. But even, I guess, in the time of the Mishnah, there was a concern. There was a concern with Gnosticism. I think that he has a note about that here. Um, Gnosticism was a prominent view. I mean, it even influenced Judaism to some extent, or some elements, some groups within Judaism. Gnosticism believed that, had a number of specific beliefs. One, it did have a dualistic view of the world. There was a goodness and there was evil, and those were two different powers in the world. It also believed that Gnostic view was that the true God was high above. We couldn't beyond our ken, beyond our ability to understand, but that there was a demigod who was the actual creator God. And so there too, you had this view that there was the ultimate God who no one knows, can see, can appreciate, and then you've got the demigod that is more materialistic and brings materialism into the world, which is corrupted and brings about evil. So it's not really clear what they were responding to, but there was this fear of dualism. And so to say modim modim suggests that maybe this person is into that kind of thinking. So we quiet the person. But then they're not sure. Okay, so that one we get. But al tov yizacher shemecha nami demashma al tov in ve'al ra lo. They also silence the one who says, "May your name be mentioned with the good," because here the issue is God is only being associated with the good, and we don't think like that. We recognize that. In fact, we have this passage in Brachot, Chayav Adam levarech al hara'a kishem shehu mevarech al hatova. One is obligated to bless on the evil, the bad things that happen, just as one is obligated to bless on the good. And I think that sounds a little bit weird, but of course we do acknowledge that everything that happens in the universe, the buck stops at God, right? That's what we say in the opening of the Yotzer Or prayer, that God creates light and darkness. God creates, the actual version from Isaiah is God creates evil and peace. So we have this notion that God creates everything. And from our perspective, something that happens may be bad, may be evil, but we can't know from God's perspective what that is. And so we're obligated to just be grateful for everything that occurs. And traditionally there is this sense of faith that whatever occurs from God is the way it's supposed to happen. And so therefore we don't distinguish between good and evil, because whatever happens, God wanted it to happen. We have faith in God. So that's the other issue. So that one also, they say that, we kind of understand if a person says that they're ve'al tov yizacher shemecha, that it looks like you're putting your thumb on the scale, that only the good stuff we're connecting God to, good stuff from our perspective. But Ella al kansi por yagi rachamecha my tama. What's the reason that we would quiet the person who says your mercy is extended to a bird's nest? Because there you're not saying really, oh, we're only blessing God for the good. We're just acknowledging that God is merciful to the bird's nest, although it's not really clear what this is a reference to. Here the Gemara explains. Two Amoraim in the west, that is Eretz Yisrael, disagree about the question. You have Rabbi Yossi bar Ravin and Rabbi Yossi bar Zvida. So one argued, and remember, whenever they say, it means the tradition doesn't remember who said what. But we have these two opinions. One opinion is mipnei shematil kin'a b'ma'aseh v'reshit, because it might engender jealousy. That is, why only on a bird's nest? What about the other animals? in the world. Let's see. They have a note here. In the Jerusalem Talmud, it is explained that the problem is that the individual limits God's mercy by implying that it is applied only to birds. So it's not just birds and nobody else. It's that's very limiting. What do you mean on the bird's nest? God is merciful to all creatures. Why would you only limit God's ability for mercifulness? The other possibility is mipnei she'osei midotav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu rachamim ve'inan el gezerot. It's a different perspective. One transforms the attributes of God into expressions of mercy, and they are nothing but decrees of the king, which is a little bit connected to what we saw up here, that may your name be mentioned with the good, only the good and not all actions. Here it's mercy. What about justice? What about the fact that things happen because God decrees them, not because God has these emotions of compassion on what to some people, and anger or vengeance towards others. God does things and we don't understand why. They are decrees. They are gizerot. This might be more in line with some of Maimonides and later philosophical thinking, that we can't understand any of the reasons that God say. When we say that God is merciful, we mean that we see acts of mercy in the world around us. The person who's very, very sick gets better, and we say, oh, that's God's mercy. But the truth of the matter is that the act is merciful. We can't say that God is merciful because that limits God. God is perfect. God doesn't change. God has God's own plan. And it's not that God is merciful or not merciful. It is that the actions that God employs in this world, the actions that we see in this world, are merciful. We designate them as merciful. So that's the other possibility, is that we don't want to limit God. We don't want to try to describe God. And we'll see as we get a little bit farther, we're going to see some other views like that. All right. So how did now we get a real life case. Love these real life cases. How did Nached Kamei de Rabbah? So Rabbah was in the synagogue, and a person came and the Nached Kamei, literally he descended before the ark, meaning that he was leading the Amidah, and in his prayer rendition. And remember, in this world they don't have prayer books, so the person is reciting the prayers that tradition tells him, that the wording that he's supposed to say, but sometimes people added in their own wording. Sometimes it was poems. Here in this case, the person is adding in a phrase. Ata chasta al kan sipur ata chus v'rachem aleinu. Very, very similar to what we saw in the Mishnah tells us you're not supposed to say. You've shown mercy to birds, as expressed. Oh, and here, I should have said also, the idea here of mercy to birds, the kan sipur sounds very much like this very odd mitzvah in Deuteronomy, where we are told, and it's set up in mitzvah language, you are obligated, when you see, you're walking down the road and you see a bird's nest, it sounds like, the way the text is written, you are obligated to shoo away the mother bird and take the eggs. Or if not obligated, but if you wanted the eggs, maybe this is what the mitzvah is saying. If you want the eggs in that nest, you have to shoo away the mother bird before you take the eggs. Not clear at all why, if it's about compassion, you're still taking the mother bird's eggs. The reason is to shoo away the mother bird so that she shouldn't be hurt when you steal her babies. You're still taking the babies. So it's not really clear what the point of that mitzvah, but because the language is similar, here you see that Steinsaltz it understands it as relating to that experience, that mitzvah. You've shown mercy to birds as expressed through the mitzvah to chase away the mother bird before taking eggs from the nest. Have mercy and pity upon us. Okay, same idea that we saw that the Mishnah was telling us, you silence the person. And there's Amar Rabba. So Rabba says when he heard this, how much does this rabbi know to appease the Lord his master? Sounds like Rabba thinks it's a cool thing. He's pleased with this. Abaye, who happens to be Rabba's nephew, said to him, didn't we learn in the Mishnah that they silence him? Uncle, what's going on here? We were told you have to silence him. But the Gemara explains to us what was going on. He knew what the rule was. He knew what the Mishnah said. He wanted to hone Abaye's intellect, meaning he wanted to see if Abaye would respond and articulate the rules of the Mishnah. So either that or Rabba forgot, and he said, "Yeah, I was just testing you." No, I think that I like this story because it's related to what we just saw, but it obviously comes from some memory that Rabba used to test his nephew Abaye to see how sharp he was. All right. Another case example of what we saw before, these situations with people reciting things in the davening that were beyond the traditional wording. So this is Rabbi Chanina, and somebody came and was davening the Amidah, and in this case, it's not related to what we saw in the Mishnah. The person davening said Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanora, which is of course what we have in our Amidah, and he continued Ha'adir, V'Chazak, V'Hamitz, Amar Le. So Rabbi Chanina said, Siyamtinhu Lishvache de Marach. He's being sarcastic here. Oh, yeah. You went on for 5 minutes praising God. That's it? You're not going to go more? Hashta Hane Tlata. Even these three praises that we recite, Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanora, had Moses not written them in the Torah, right? This phrase, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanora, comes from Deuteronomy chapter 10. And had the members of the Great Assembly, right, that's our Knesset Hagdolah, not come and incorporated them into the Amidah prayer, we would not be permitted to recite them. Because how can we truly express God's greatness? It's beyond our ability to really express it. We only use these three praises because that's what tradition tells us, and Moses came up with it. But otherwise, it's meaningless. And here's an example. It's comparable to a man who possessed many thousands of gold dinars, yet they were praising him for owning 1,000 silver ones. Right? It's like you go up to Jeff Bezos, and I don't know, he's got one of these super yachts, and you say, "Man, that is a really nice rowboat that you've got there. What a beautiful thing! It's really well built, and I think that's great." Rowboat? Did you see the yacht? So isn't that deprecatory toward him? So therefore, we limit it because otherwise it seems presumptuous of us. It seems like we really know God. Well, we don't know God, so we just use the phrases that Moses gave us, and that's it. Amar Rabbi Chanina, another statement, another teaching by Rabbi Chanina. Hakol bidei shamayim chutz miyirat shamayim. Everything is in the hands of heaven except for the fear or reverence of heaven. And then he gives us a proof text. Ve'ata Yisrael ma Adonai Elohecha shoel meimach ki im liyira. Now, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you other than to fear or to revere, have awe, to understand God with awe? This is a very well-known phrase, meaning that because when we try to understand, this is one of the issues with free will, right? If everything is the hands of heaven, then how do people do things that are out of line with what God wants? Oh, hey, Ezekiel. Glad you are joining me. Otherwise, I thought I was going to be all by myself. So, but I'm going to keep going. We're just at the beginning of 25. So
Okay, Rabbi.
okay. So you should be able to see the text on the screen.
Yes.
Okay. So we're at this passage right here with Rabbi Hanina, where he says everything is in the hands of heaven except for the fear of heaven. And I was just saying that it has to do a little bit with um, the concern, the challenge of free will. That is, if we have if God is in charge of everything, if God is omniscient and omnipresent, how is it possible for us to not follow what God wants? I mean, shouldn't God immediately stop people? And the answer that Rebbe Hanina gives in this to this theological challenge is, yeah, well, everything is in the hands of God except for fear of God or reverence for God. So if people don't have respect for God, then they're gonna God can't control that. God can only control kind of the material aspect of the world. Um, but the verse, the proof text from Deuteronomy, and now Israel, what does the Lord ask of you? Yisrael, ma Adonai Elohecha shoel mimach, ki im liyirah. See, that's the only thing that God wants because everything else is in God's control. The only thing is this yirah, sense of fear, or I think it's a better translation, this sense of awe before God, this sense of reverence. But the Gemara looks at it and says, well, that seems like they're making it into a minor matter, like miklal the yira milta zutrahi. Like that's the only thing. It's like it's such a simple thing that God is asking for. It's making it like, that's the only thing that God wants of you. How hard is that? And the Gemara responds, in legabe Moshe Rabbeinu milta zutarti. Yeah, for Moses, who made the statement about what does God ask of you except to revere God? Yeah, for Moses, okay, that was a little thing. Mashal le'adam shemevakshim himenu kli gadol v'yesh lo dome alav kekli katan. So it's like a person who had this really large vessel, really value. Let's say a person who has, anybody who has something, if you, it seems like no big deal to him because he owns it. Right? He's already got it. But but one who's asked for just a small vessel and he doesn't have it, then it's a big deal. So Moses, for whom reverence and connection and linkage to God was what should I say? Understood. It was automatic. I mean, Moses was the greatest of the prophets. So for him, that appropriate respect and reverence for God was an automatic thing. He was on that wavelength. But for those of us, normal people, it's not such a little thing. It's really, really a hard thing to do. So it is. So when Rabbi Hanina says that's what we have to strive for is this reverence before heaven, that is really a big challenge for each of us. And it's not a small thing. We all have to work very hard to achieve that. Okay, now we're back to the next thing in the Mishnah, where the Mishnah told us if a person says in their prayers, when they're doing the Amidah, and they get to the Modim prayer, and they say Modim, Modim, we shut them down because we're afraid that it's heretical, that they're suggesting that there are two powers in the world. There's power of goodness and the power of evil. So here Rabbi Zera said, yeah.
And that's what what it says in the Mishnah Berachot, in the tractate Berachot.
Yeah, I think it is, isn't it? It's in Brachot too. I thought, I think some of this stuff is in Brachot as well. I should have looked it up, but yeah, I thought it sounded a lot more familiar having studied Brachot. So yeah, so Modim, yes, of course, it's in I think it's in the last chapter of Brachot. Right, so this is the same teaching, same lesson. If a person who says Modim, you quiet the person. They're not allowed to say that because of this fear of dualism. So what about, so now Rabbi Zera says, Ha'omer Shma Shma is like a person who says Modim Modim, and you have to stop that person. Because again, the concern that maybe they're responding to two different gods, right? Let's see. Most of the commentaries maintain that one who says the complete verse. Oh, we'll get to this in a second. But I wanted to say the halacha is it is prohibited to repeat the Shema whether one repeats the entire verse or any individual word. If one was not focused while reciting the verse, he should repeat it quietly. However, when one reviews the weekly Torah portion by reciting each verse twice, and then as the Targum, he may read the verse of the Shema twice. Okay, so you're not supposed to repeat the Shema, but there are cases when we repeat the Shema. All right, so here's the Gemara raises an objection from a Raita. Hakoreyet Shema v'kofla. Person who recites the Shema and repeats it, hareze miguneh. This is not appropriate. He translated as reprehensible here. Migunehu dehave shtuke lo mishatkinle. All right, so it's reprehensible, meaning it's not, you shouldn't do that, but it doesn't say anything about shutting the person down, silencing them. So lo kasha, here the Gemara resolves it. Ha de amar milta milta vitanela, ha de amar psuka psuka vitanela. We're talking about two different cases. One case, the person says Shema, Shema, Yisrael, Yisrael, and the other person one says Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. What's not clear here is which one is shut down and which one is just not doing the right thing. Steinsaltz's explanation is following Rashi, and he says where one repeats. Yeah, the case where one repeats Shema, and it is reprehensible, but they don't silence him, is referring to one who recites and repeats each individual word. So you say Shema, Shema, Yisrael, Yisrael. That's just ridiculousness. No, you're not supposed to say the Shema that way. It's inappropriate. Don't do it. However, the case where Rabbi Zera is talking about where we silence the person is referring to one who repeats the entire verse. Now, Joshua Kulp, in his commentary, he's a conservative rabbi who teaches at Schechter Institute in Jerusalem. He says that other commentaries say it's the opposite, that it's actually the one who repeats Shema, Shema, Yisrael, Yisrael. That's the person we silence, because we're not sure what he's doing. It may be that he's suggesting two different deities. Whereas if you say Shema Yisrael twice, that's acceptable. Or, I mean, it's not acceptable. It's wrong, but it's not. You don't silence the person. And he points out that there are, and just as we saw in the halacha, there are times when we say it twice. Now, one is, we'll get to the story in a moment, where you've lost your phone. You got to say the Shema with intention. So what if you just Shema Yisrael, you're not paying attention, and you go, oh my goodness, I got to say it again. That's one example. The other example is we do it at the end of Yom Kippur services. We repeat the Shema at the end of Yom Kippur services, the very last time, right? We're repeating a lot of different things. So he says that it's not so clear which is the case where we shut the person down and which is the case where we just say that's not appropriate, don't do it, don't do it again. But here's another, again, a real life case. Rav Papa said to Rava with regard to this halacha, Dilma me'ikara lo kivein date v'hashta kivein date. Maybe it was a case you have to say it with devotion, with intention, and here he didn't say it with proper intention. So Rava says to him, can one have such a degree of familiarity with heaven? That is it possible that a person could say Shema taking these words so lightly? And if he did, we beat him with a blacksmith hammer until he focuses attention. So that's why I put in my notes. I said, at Sinai, we don't do that. Somebody says it without proper attention, we will not beat you until you say it properly. But that was Rava's response. Okay, here's another response to the Mishnah. If you modify the translation of the text of the Ariel, like we read yesterday in Achrei Mot. If while translating that text, you said like this, this is referring to one who says the shame of his father and the shame of his mother, instead of saying the nakedness of one's father and the nakedness of one's mother, which has to deal with, actually is already kind of a euphemism for sexual relations, that is, incestuous relations with one's parents. But if you're embarrassed to say that, use the word nakedness, and you say the shame of the father or the mother, that's not appropriate. You got to say it the way it is meant. And also, ha'omeru mizaracha lo titein lahavir lemolech. And if you say you can't give your seed to them who sacrifice their children, like to the Molech, if you translate it in this way about, well, what it really, you translate it to the community as you're not allowed to impregnate Gentile women, then that person is silent, because one who translates the verse in this manner maintains that the verse speaks of a Jew who has relations with a Gentile woman and fathered from her a son who will be raised to engage in idol worship. That is, from the school of Yishmael, they might be translating it in a way to suggest not literally committing infanticide, killing the baby, but in fact having relations with Gentile women and having children with them. And Joshua Kulp, again in his commentary, very interesting. He said he believes that this is an inner conflict among the rabbis of the day, where some were questioning the whole notion of conversion and whether converted Jews, what status do they have? Whereas the majority school, the majority view, wanted to have a very, very positive attitude. They wanted to encourage conversions. So they don't want you translating the text and saying, oh, it's really bad for a Jew who has relations with a Gentile woman and has kids, because you want to bring people in. You want to say, hey, we're open to conversion. We're open to outsiders. So so I just thought his comment was interesting. Let's see what Steinsaltz has. It would seem that this sage interprets the verse precisely as the Mishnah states one may not interpret it. Some explain that the sage, that is from the school of Rabbi Yishmael, was merely explaining the mistaken interpretation. But he says that's difficult. Others explain it's referring to one who interprets the verses relating only to Arameans. And that it was permissible to have relations with other Gentile women. The sage from the school explained that it can also be suggested that the interpretation of the verse as referring to fathering a child with a Gentile woman is a valid homiletical approach, but doesn't represent the meaning of the verse. So that's his view. But I thought his approach was very interesting, because we know from the New Testament reporting that the rabbis they were looking for converts. And so to translate it this way might turn people off. Okay, next Mishnah. Here we get a whole list of things, and we get into the Gemara of what is read but not translated, and what is read and translated. So, Maaseh Ruvain nikra velo mitargem. The incident with Ruvain sleeping with his father's concubine, Bilhah, is read, of course, because it's what it's in the Torah, but we don't translate it publicly. Maaseh Tamar nikra umitargem. But the incident of Judah and Tamar, even though it seems a little embarrassing to Judah, we still translate it publicly. Maaseh Egel Harishon nikra umitargem. The incident of the golden calf we do translate after we read it. The Hasheni, that is the section where right afterwards, where Moses is critical, he's criticizing his brother Aaron for letting things get out of hand. That is read, of course, because the text says it, but we don't translate it publicly. Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessings. And the incident of David and Amnon are read, but these are not translated. We'll get to this in a moment. Ein maftirin b'merkava. According to one opinion, we do not recite the prophetic sections. We don't read publicly the Merkava. That's the first chapter of Ezekiel. That's his vision where he sees this divine. He sees God on the chariot, and these wild animals around the divine. But Rabbi Yehuda says no, we can. We can recite the Haftarah from that section, which in fact we do at Shavuot. Rabbi Eliezer says, Ein maftirim, we do not recite the Haftarah of this section in Ezekiel chapter 16, where it says, make known to Jerusalem her abominations. It's very critical of Israel, and so we don't want to say that. We don't read that publicly. Okay, here's the Gemara. Tanu Rabbanan, yesh nikreinu mitargamin. These are the things which we read and we do translate. And there are things which we read and do not translate. And there are things which are not read and are not translated. And here's the list. Elu nikra'inu mitargamin. And then we have this little mnemonic symbol to remember this. Balat akan nishpa. That's the siman. Okay, so we're going to go through it now. Ma'asev reshit nikra umitargem. The creation story we read and translate. Pshita, I mean, what? Of course we do. What's the big deal? Malhuda tema, because you might have thought atu l'shayule malamala malamata malifnim umalachor kamashmalan, because you might have been concerned with the fact that if you're reading, the Torah just starts with the creation, and the fear might be, well, what if people start asking like, well, where was God before the creation? What's above the heavens? What's below the heavens? We start asking questions, but the Gemara says we don't worry about that. That's okay. We still read it and translate it. We read and translate the story of Lot and his incestuous relations with his daughters. Well, of course, it's in the text. Well, you might have felt that it's not appropriate because it insults Abraham's honor, because it was Abraham's relatives, right? It's Abraham's nephew and his great nieces. But nevertheless, we read it out loud. Maaseh Tamar v'Huda nikra umitargem. The story of Tamar and Judah. Well, obviously you're going to translate it. Well, you might have thought that it was insulting to Judah, and we don't want to make that public. Kamash malan shvachehu de odei. Actually, in this case, it honors Judah because he admitted his wrong. He confessed, as it was the way he had done wrong. So that's actually honorable. Maaseh Egel harishon nikra umitargem. So the story of the Egel Hazahav, the golden calf, we read, of course. Well, you might have thought it was insulting to Israel, that the people of Israel bowed down to this idol. Kamash malan kol shekein denicha lahu dehavya lahu kapara. No, actually, we want to make sure we read it because when they read this passage, the Jewish people listening to it will be embarrassed, and they will behave in a way to achieve atonement. What about klalot uvrachot? Nikrainu mitargamin. The curses and the blessings and curses, which we read in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, we read and we translate. Well, of course. Well, no, you might have thought that, again, this was, not only is it insulting, is it scary, but to read that stuff and hear the horrible tortures that are going to happen if we don't follow the Torah, but people might become dismayed. They'll paigadate. They'll become weakened. Their integrity, I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but they'll be weakened and maybe say, oh my God, there's no hope. But we read it, and nevertheless we read it and translate it. Azharot ve'onashin, same thing. We read and translate the warnings and the punishments in the Torah. Again, isn't that obvious? Well, again, you might be here you might be concerned that people will now observe the Torah only because of yirah, only because of fear, and not because of love of God and love of Torah, but only because we're terrified of the punishments. It's really kind of interesting here. The yirah word again is used, where a moment ago it was that's what we're supposed to achieve is yirah, but here it's clearly fear, which is a negative emotion, and we want to observe Torah out of love. Okay, but nevertheless, we read those sections and translate them. And Maaseh Amnon v'Tamar nikra umitargem. Now this is not in the Torah, but if you're ever reading it out loud, or reading the text in that story where Amnon rapes his half sister, we read it and we translate it. Well, why wouldn't we? It's because it might be insulting to David. We're going to get to a second view of that in a moment. Maaseh pilegesh bagiv'ah nikra umitargem. Okay, this is one of the ugliest stories in Torah, in the Bible. It comes from Judges, and it's what happens is a person from let's see if they give a well a person comes with his concubine, and he comes to a town, Gibeah, which is in the Benjamin tribe, and the men there, it's kind of like the story of Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah, and they threaten the man, and he throws his concubine out to let them have their will with her. When they do, and she is basically murdered through this abusive behavior. She dies. She's killed by this abusive behavior. And then the guy who was so horrible that he threw his concubine out to the mercy of the rioters, he then cuts up her body, sends a piece of her body to each of the other tribes, and says, let's go to war. And this leads to a civil war. The Benjaminites are almost completely wiped out. And so it's a very horrible, ugly incident. And the Gemara's concern is, this is really ugly, and it will condemn the honor of the Benjaminite tribe. It's one of the tribes. But nevertheless, we read it. We don't shy away from it. Same thing with the make known to Jerusalem her abominations. It's read and translated. Down up above in the Mishnah, it said that we don't translate it, or we don't even read it. We don't read it as a haftarah. And the Gemara says, no, it's obvious that you do. And this is needed. The reason why the Gemara, the Tosefta, which is, again, a text contemporaneous with the Mishnah, but it didn't make it into the Mishnah. So it's like a Baraita. And the Gemara is explaining, why does the Tosefta teach this, which is different from the Mishnah? Because they wanted to exclude that opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who said you can't read it as a haftarah. And then it's taught in a Baraita. There was an incident with regard to a certain man who was reading this haftarah in the presence of Rabbi Eliezer. And he read that verse, make known to Jerusalem her abominations. And Rabbi Eliezer said to him, hey, buddy, before you are reading publicly and describing the abominations of Jerusalem, why don't you go and examine your own family's closet, the abominations of your own mother? Now, it turns out that obviously Rabbi Eliezer, who was a powerful rabbi, had some kind of, insight, and they went and examined the guy's lineage and found that he had a stain of illegitimacy. So Rabbi Eliezer was correct to question his lineage, and that was Rabbi Eliezer's teaching. That's where the teaching came from. You don't recite these abominations of Jerusalem publicly. Turns out, though, that we actually do. And that was the point of the Gemara was making, is that in fact we teach. The Tosefta was teaching that you can read this because it was undoing the view of Rabbi Eliezer, which came out of this situation. Okay, Tosefta continues. Ve'elu nikra'in velo mitargemin. So here's their list of things that we read, but we do not publicly translate. The incident of Ruvain is read and not translated. That's like what we read in the Mishnah. And there was an incident involving Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, who went to the village of Kavul, and the sexton was of the synagogue read, and it came to pass while Israel dwelt in that land, and Reuven went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. And Rabbi Chanina said to the translator, stop, only translate the end of the verse. The end of the verse says, the sons of Jacob, it goes into a new passage, the sons of Jacob were 12, including Reuven in one of the 12, and then it immediately mentions Reuven as the oldest child. So even though he had done this thing, it's clear from the Torah that Reuven was not, booted out of the family. So the sages praised Rabbi Chanina for telling the translator to not translate the passage about Reuven laying with Bilhah, only the first part of the verse and the last part of the verse. So that's where we got that idea from. Also, the Tosefta tells us, Maaseh Egel Hasheni Nikra V'lo Mitargem. We don't translate that second part where Moses says to Aaron, what did you do? What did you see that you allowed all these people to go, to get, to do this? We don't translate that section. It's just, you can see here, it's 4 verses from Moses said to Aaron to Moses saw. Again, because it's embarrassing to Aaron. It's hurtful to his honor. Now we have a Baraita that goes has a little more information. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said, Le'olam yehei adam zahir b'tshuvotav. A person should always be careful with how he responds, because what did Aaron say to Moses when Moses said, what did you do? His response was, Va'ashlichehu va'esh, I threw this gold that the people gave me into the fire. Vayetze ha'egel hazeh. I didn't make the egel. It just came out. Well, obviously Aaron said it that way because he was trying to, minimize his responsibility. But by doing so, it suggests I cast it into the fire and the calf came forth by itself. It may have suggest to some people that there was dark magic going on here. It wasn't Aaron, it just the calf came forth by itself. Demons, or dark magic or something. So Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is saying, you got to be careful with how you respond to people's questions, because if you're not careful, they're going to read into it something you don't want them to read into it. Birkat Kohanim Nikra'im V'lo Mitargemin. This was kind of interesting. We don't translate the priestly blessings. And the reason is because in the third line of the priestly blessings, it says, Yisa Adonai, I gotta do Yisa Adonai Panave Lecha. May the Lord lift up God's countenance to you, meaning may God favor you. And listeners may understand this to mean that God shows unfair favoritism to the Jewish people. It's also possible that it sounds like the Jewish people are not worthy of having God favor them. When, as we know, it's because it's not really because of anything the Jewish people do. I guess that's what I was trying to say. It's that God has chosen. Again, this is a gezerah. This is God's chosen. We're chosen by God, not because of for any objective standard, but subjectively. God wants the Jewish people to be the chosen people, and that's why we are. It's so therefore, I guess what they're trying to say is, it sounds like God's being favoring Jewish people unfairly when it's not an issue of fairness at all. I think that might be what they're saying. Let's see if he ends. No, it doesn't say. Okay. Maaseh David ve'Amnon lo nikra'id ve'lo mitargemin. So the incident of David and Amnon are not read publicly, and they're not translated publicly. well, wait a minute. We just saw we just read that this incident of Amnon raping his sister. In fact, we do translate it. So here the explanation is the resolution of the Gemara is that the statement of the Mishnah applies where Amnon's name is written, Amnon ben David. There we don't translate it publicly or read it. I'm sorry, this was in the Mishnah. This isn't the Tosefta. I got it backwards. The Mishnah says that it's not read or translated. But we just read a moment ago, the Tosefta said you do. So the difference is wherever Amnon's name is written, Amnon ben David, we don't read it because that's embarrassing. It's hurtful to David that, we're referring to this bad guy, Amnon, his son, and then we're connecting him to David. But wherever it's written Amnon, then we do read it. We can read those statements publicly. All right, now we keep going. Tanu Rabbanan, Kol mikraot hakutuvim b'Torah leganai korin otan l'shevach. Oh, here's a list. We have this tradition of in the Torah, also in prophets, that sometimes the word is written, but we read it differently. And the reason is because the term as it is written is so coarse or so grotesque, so rude, we don't read it publicly. We use a euphemism. So in the passage of the curses in Deuteronomy, the term yishgalena is read, even though it's written yishkav. Wait. The term yishgalena is read as though it is said yishkavena. Wait a minute, that's not. No, we don't read yishgalena. That's what's written in the Torah. We read yishkavena. Right. The term bafolim is read batchorim. The term hiryonim in the passage in 2 Kings 6 is read divyonim. The phrase to eat their own excrement, horehem, and drink their own urine, memeshinehem, that's written in the Torah, but we read it with more delicate terms. Lamocharaot is read as lamotzaot, although Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha says you can read it the way it's written because we're describing contemptible behavior for idol worship, and you can use an indelicate term for that. Amar Rav Nachman, kol leitzanuta asira bar mi leitzanuta de avodah zara de sharia. Whenever you're mocking idol worship, you can use the really coarse terms because you're mocking idol worship. So it's written, Bel bows down. This is from Isaiah. Kara Bel kores nevo. The prophet mocks these idols by describing them as crouching in order to defecate. Additionally, it is written, they stoop, they bow down together, they could not deliver the burden. Rabbi Yanai said this principle that one is permitted to mock idol worship is derived from here. This verse in Hosea, the inhabitants of Samaria shall be in dread for the calves of Beit Aven, for its people shall mourn over it, and its priests shall tremble for it, for its glory, because it is departed from it. Do not read kivodo, its glory, but rather kivedo, meaning that it is unable to restrain itself from defecating. So we can mock these idol, anything having to do with idols. And here we conclude the passage. We're going to end on a good note because that stuff was kind of gross. Okay. Amar Rav Huna bar Manoach mishmei de Rav Acha berei de Rav Ika. Share le levar Yisrael lememar le legoy shekalei la'avodah zara ve'anche b'shin tav shalom. This isn't the nice part yet. Take your idol. It is permitted for a Jew to say to a Gentile, take your idol and put it in your shin tav, your shet, which is buttocks. Okay. Rav Ashi said, Hai man disnai shumanei share le levazuye begimel vishin. Rav Ashi said, one whose reputation is tarnished, he is known as a philanderer, let's say. It's a person that person is permitted to humiliate him by calling him a gimel sin. Gemara itself did not explain clearly the meaning of this in order to avoid writing coarse language. The commentaries dispute the meaning of the acronym. Rashi explains in the name of his teachers that it stands for Gaifa Shatya, foolish harlot. Some explain that it means son of a Gentile, Goya Shivcha. Others explain that it stands for a rebuke, Ga'ara, and excommunication, Shamta. The Gemara in Tractate Sanhedrin derives from here that it is permitted to mock the parents of a wicked individual, even if the parents themselves are not wicked. Okay, well, anyway, whatever it means is really very rude. But you can say that because the guy's reputation is tarnished. You can say these kind of humiliating things. Who's that? What's his name? Harvey Weinberg, Weisberg, whatever the movie producer who went to I think he went to jail, who got it was brought out all the abusive behavior towards female actresses that he engaged in and how he forced himself on them. Well, it's okay. Such a guy like that, well, you can humiliate him by calling him a certain name. In this case, whatever Gimel Sin means. But here's the conclusion. We end on a good note. If that's true about a person one who's is true a negative reputation, well, how much the more so one whose reputation is commendable, it is permitted to publicly praise him. It is not advisable to praise others in public, as it can lead to mentioning the individual's faults. Yeah, this is a rule about Lashon Hara. We have to be careful even mentioning positive things about people in public, because it can always easily slide into negative things. You might say, oh, so-and-so, I really like, he's a really good guy. And then somebody might say, yeah, when he's not, I don't know, he's not davening because he has such a terrible voice. I don't know, I'm just making something up here. But so we want to be careful. So sometimes even when we say nice things about people, it can lead to somebody then saying something negative. That's why the Gemara says here, according to this comment, it was necessary for the Gemara to mention that it is permitted to do so in a case praising the individual who deserves it, because it increases the honor of heaven. So somebody whose reputation is very commendable, it is permitted to publicly praise him, and the person who praises him, blessings will rest upon his head. Okay, and therefore we have concluded Chapter 3, Hadran Alach HaKorei et HaMegillah Omeid. So we will return to you. May it be your will, God, that we return to this study again with the Megillah in this chapter. And we will start next week going into chapter 4. Now, I am going to send out the conclusion. It's almost the end of 25b. So we'll do that next week. I will send out... let me stop the share here. I'm going to send out the schedule for the last pages, because there are a bunch of weeks that we can't meet. June 5th is Shavuot. That's a Sunday. May 15th, which is a couple of weeks from now, I've got to be in Chicago on that day, so we won't meet then either. But we are going to finish this by the middle of June. June 12th, I also have an obligation at 11 o'clock. So either we'll meet at 12 o'clock, or we'll meet at maybe 10 o'clock and try to finish the page so I can get to this. It's an unveiling at 11 o'clock. But one way or another, we're going to get done by June 19th. We will finish this tractate and then, give people the summer off. Okay, good to see you.
What's the